Oh boy. When I wake up each day, I feel so weary. Try to face the world, but it's so dreary. But I found that special thing that makes me cheery. Time to do music theory. Music theory. Greetings and welcome to our second video of theory review concepts. This is the second page of the Recovered Memories worksheet, and it deals exclusively with questions of musical form. Just as the first page dealt with questions about harmony, the second page is all about form. It's a good place for us to talk about, how do things like sonata form and fugal works and variation forms go about doing their business and stuff. So I thought we would work through that second Recovered Memories worksheet page. So if you haven't tried to answer those questions for yourself already, I would recommend you do that before going through the answers here. So first thing you want to do is have that worksheet ready. Write down these answers as we do them, because you're going to want to be able to pull these back when we're analyzing stuff for class. And the first question you want to answer for yourself is, how does binary form work? And again, don't just say it's an A-B form. That's a monkey answer. Anybody can do that. You need to know what really distinguishes binary music. So that's what I want us to discuss in this presentation. So after you've gone through and answered all the questions on the worksheet, make sure that you listen to my answers as well, because my answer for what binary form is like is this. Binary form is an A-B form. You're right about that. But there are things that happen in the A and B that characterize binary form. One thing is that binary forms have motivic unity between section A and section B. What does that mean? Basically, that means this. The musical ideas in section B look like the musical ideas we were seeing in section A. If section A had like a little motive that started with a dotted eighth note and a 16th note and went down in an arpeggio, ba-da-dum, boom, 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 then section B is probably also going to have various ways of treating that dotted eighth note, 16th note, descending motive idea. The motives of part A are developed in part B. That's one very, very important thing about binary form. It has motivic unity. And the other important thing about binary form, when the music is tonal, when it has a tonal center and maybe a key signature and stuff like that, is there's tonal motion that happens in binary form in section A and section B. In section A of a binary form, we start in one key, and by the time we get to the end of section A, we're not in that key. We have modulated to some other key. And then in section B, we modulate back to the tonic. So there's tonal motion away from the tonic in section A and back to the tonic in section B. And it looks a few different ways. There's a nice little diagram of how a binary form might go, with little double bars separating section A from section B. And if a binary form's in a major key, its favorite thing to do is start in the tonic and modulate to the dominant key by the end of section A. So if you had a binary form that was in the key of B flat major, then by the end of a section A, it would probably have modulated to F major. That's the dominant. And in section B, it's going to get back to the key of B flat major, to the tonic key by the ending. It may go through a whole bunch of other keys at the beginning of section B, but it'll ultimately come back to the tonic. Minor key binary works a little bit differently. The most common thing a minor key binary form does is it modulates from the tonic to the relative major in section A. So if a minor key binary piece starts out in the key of G minor, by the time it gets to the end of section A, it will have modulated to B flat major. And then In section B, it may go through a whole bunch of keys, but it'll ultimately get back to where it can end in G minor. Sometimes minor key binary things, though, look like major key binaries. They go from tonic to dominant in section A and then back to the tonic in section B. Notice that the dominant's minor, though. So if you had a binary form that was in the key of D minor, it would modulate maybe to A minor at the end of section A and then come back to D minor. But that's the big story of binary form. It's got motivic unity in section A and section B. Section B develops the melodic ideas of section A, and it's got tonal motion. Section A modulates away from the tonic. Section B modulates back to it. That's how that binary A-B form actually plays out. Make sense? And there is one other thing we need to think about with binary form, which is that there's that thing out there called rounded binary form, which does all the things non-rounded binary form, or what we call simple binary form, does. It's got the motivic unity between A and B. It modulates away from the tonic in section A and back to the tonic in section B. But the other thing that these rounded binary forms do is they bring back the opening melodic idea. That's what we call the A prime. So a rounded binary form isn't just AB, like simple binary form is. A rounded binary form is A, B, A prime. And what that A prime represents is two things. It represents that the opening melodic idea comes back, and the second thing is that opening melodic idea comes back in the tonic key. So you see the first melodic idea you heard like around measure 1 in a binary form coming back in its original key, perhaps around measure 35 or 44 or something like that. So rounded binary form has this little melodic component on it where it actually brings back the opening melodic idea as A prime. Ternary form is actually a lot easier to define than binary form. Ternary form is an ABA form, and the thing that really marks ternary form is that there's contrast between the music in section A and section B. Whatever the melodic ideas are in section B, they tend to be quite different than the melodic ideas in section A. Beyond that, there's not a lot required for ternary form. Binary form has more it has to do. Needs to develop the ideas in section B. Binary form needs to modulate away from the tonic in section A and back to the tonic in section B. Ternary form just needs to be different, contrasting in section B compared to what happened in section A. Besides that, there are no real requirements. Usually the A section of a ternary form ends in the key it began in. If it started in D major, it's going to end on a 1 chord in the key of D major. The A sections of ternary form are what we call tonally closed, meaning they end on the same key they began in. Unlike binary form, where the A sections are tonally open, they end in a different key than they began in. But really for ternary, it's all about contrast. The B music is different than the A music. And it can be different by being different melodic materials, by switching to a very different key. Maybe the A section was in B major and the B section is in B minor or something like that. You can even change meter. You can change the rhythmic values you're using. You can change the dynamics. Anything that can create sharp contrast is fair game in a ternary form. So you can see how the form waters can get a little bit muddy here, because we have ternary form that goes ABA, and we have rounded binary form that goes ABA prime. So a lot of people have difference telling an ABA form apart from an ABA prime form. Here's how you work through that. The main thing is, remember this: binary music and ternary music are very different in terms of what they seek to do. Binary music tends to present us with an idea in the A section and then develop or expand upon that idea in the B section. It develops or expands upon it by taking the initial melodic materials and developing them through sequence and fragmentation and other sorts of techniques like that. Binary takes things from A and develops them in part B. Ternary, however, presents us with an idea in the A section, and then in the B section, ternary form presents us with a different contrasting idea. So ternary uses the B section for different things. A ternary B section tends to create contrast with what we heard in the A section, whereas a binary B section tends to develop what we heard in the A section. So really the big way to clear up the confusion is to look at the B section and decide, what is the B section doing? Is the B section developing ideas from the A section? If so, it's probably binary. Or is the B section presenting me with contrasting ideas from the A section, in which case it's probably ternary. And the other way you can distinguish between rounded binary and ternary is look at the first A section and see what happens. Because remember, a binary A section is going to modulate. It's going to be tonally open. If you're in A major, you're probably going to modulate to E major by the end of the A section. You're not going to end on a 1 chord in the key of A. But a ternary A section tends to be tonally closed. If it starts in F minor, then the A section of a ternary form probably ends on a 1 chord in the key of F minor. So those are the two ways to tell rounded binary and ternary apart. Because, of course, the thing that makes it confusing for everybody is that the A comes back in some form or another. In ternary, it comes back quite often exactly like we saw it the first time, as just plain old A. In rounded binary, the A section comes back in a modified form that we call A prime. And a lot of times that modification is because we don't want it to modulate this time. We want the A prime section to end in the tonic. But the way to tell rounded binary and ternary is twofold. What's happening in the B section? Is it developing the A section, which is a binary thing, or is it contrasting the A section, which is a ternary thing? And the other thing about binary forms and ternary forms is look at your first A section. Is it modulating away from the tonic and ending not on the 1 chord? In that case, it's probably binary. Or is your A section ending on the 1 chord of the key it began in? Is it tonally closed? In which case, it's probably ternary. So much of the world's problems would be solved if we just, remembered these things that make binary and ternary different. Okay, on to the next thing. Next thing's about variation forms. And the main thing about variation form, which is a very, very common form, you find it through all the cultures of the world and stuff. It's a very, very useful form in all types of musics, in all types of historical eras. And basically it's very useful because it's based on a very simple idea. You put forth a musical idea, state a musical idea, and then you present modified restatements of that idea. And another name for a modified restatement is to call it a variation. So we hear something, and then we hear something restated in a different form, varied. That's how variation form works. And you can get a bunch of great music out of that idea. That's why it's been around for such a long time and why we find it being used in so many different musical situations. When we're talking about the Western approach to variation forms, we're talking about really two different styles of variation, so-called continuous variations and sectional variations. Continuous variations tend to be variations where there's a pattern that's played over and over and over, and while that pattern is played, there are different melodic ideas that happen. So you might have a variation form where somebody just plays a bass part over and over and over again, and it doesn't change. Maybe it's the same little 4-measure phrase. And over that repeated 4-measure bass pattern, the melody will be doing different things. Those different things are the variations. That's one type of continuous variation. There are these names we use for continuous variations. We call them chacones or grounds or pasacallas. Those terms are moderately useful. Moderately useful because while they all describe continuous variation forms, it's not like all the composers and performers ever sat down at any point and said, let's all agree this is what chaconne means. Let's agree this is what passacaglia means. So because of that, you can't say 100% what a chaconne is like other than to say it's a continuous variation. A passacaglia is a continuous variation, but one man's passacaglia might be another man's chaconne. The way continuous variations work, though, is there's a repeated pattern, and new melodic ideas happen as that pattern goes on. Sometimes that repeated pattern happens just in the bass voice. It's a little rhythmic intervallic pattern that goes on without change. That might be called a ground bass. Sometimes you have that repeated rhythmic intervallic pattern that's in the bass, but it might move up to a higher voice. Same pattern keeps going, but instead of staying as the lowest part, it might go up in an octave or two, which means that the variations that we hear might happen below it as well as above it. And sometimes a continuous variation isn't a rhythmic melodic pattern that happens, it's just a sequence of chords. I might decide I'm just going to sit there and play 1, 6, 2, 5, 1, 6, 2, 5 as a 4-measure pattern over and over and over and over and over again. And that repeated chord progression would have different melodic ideas going on with it. And that would be a continuous variation. Now, when we're talking about sectional variations, we're talking about the things that a Mozart or a Brahms or somebody often calls theme and variations or theme with variations. And when it's a sectional variation, there's usually a complete musical theme that starts. It might be like 24, 36, 48 measures long, a rather long musical theme that happens. Could even be in its own little form. It could be in binary form or rounded binary or ternary form or whatever. And that theme has a certain structure to it. It has phrases. It might have like a double period for the A section. But what happens is the variations are basically going to take that little, let's say, 24-measure theme we heard in rounded binary form, perhaps. And every variation we hear is probably also going to be a 24-measure rounded binary form. And we'll see the same things that happen in the theme in terms of modulation, perhaps, in terms of sequential melodic materials. We'll see those being repeated but developed in the variations. And let's talk about imitative forms, the most noteworthy of which are fugal works. And one thing to think about with fugues is that fugues have a little 3-part design. They tend to have an opening section we call an exposition. They tend to have a development section, and they have what we call a closing section. And there are certain things that happen in each of these sections. For each instance, in the exposition of a fugue, what happens is we hear the main melodic idea, which we call the subject. And then we hear answers to that subject. A fugue is an imitative form. And the way it works is this. It states its opening melodic idea, its subject, in the tonic key. And then we hear an answer or an imitation of that subject, usually a perfect fifth higher or a perfect fourth lower, so that it sounds like it's in the dominant key. So if I play a subject that sounds like it's in A minor, then when I answer it, I'm going to play that same pattern, but I'm going to play it a fifth up or a fourth down in E minor. And an exposition of a fugue is where you state the subject or the answer in every part. So if you're writing a 3-voice fugue, the exposition probably ends when all 3 voices have had a turn to state either the subject or the answer. A 4-voice fugue might go subject, answer, and all 4 voices get a turn. Or it might go subject, answer, answer, subject, or subject, answer, subject, subject, or whatever. There's no hard, fast rule about it. The development section of a fugue basically has a couple things. It happens when the exposition's over, and it has 2 ingredients. Developments have episodes and middle entries. And an episode is a place in the development section where we do not hear a complete statement of the subject. You might hear fragmentation of the subject. You know, there might be examples of the composer taking the beginning of the subject and fragmenting that, or taking just the ending part of the subject and using that to develop. But what episodes usually do is they modulate. And they modulate, and then we hear complete statements of the subject, which we call middle entries. And a middle entry is usually a complete statement of the subject in a key that's not the tonic or the dominant. So if you have a fugue in C major, then in the exposition, the subjects will be stated in the key of C, the answers will be stated in the key of G, and in our development section, our middle entries might show up in keys like A minor or D minor or F major or some related key. And the final thing that happens in a fugal work is the closing section, which is where we hear the subject restated in the tonic key. And then who knows what happens, but the thing's eventually going to end. One thing that we like to say about fugues a lot is that fugue is not a form. Fugue is a technique. Part of why we say that's because it sort of gets us off the hook of like having to make it sound like every fugue does the exact same thing, because different fugues have different ways of being. But this is sort of the basic design. Exposition, where the subject and answers are stated in all the parts. A development section of indeterminate length, where there are episodes that modulate and we hear complete statements of the subject, which are called middle entries. And then the subject returns in the tonic for the closing section and leads to the conclusion. And one thing we do with all these smaller forms we've talked about, like binary and ternary, is we found ways to turn them into larger forms. We meaning they, the dead composers who write all the music we study. Well, you know, if you think about a rondo is a form where we have an A section that alternates with B section and section C and stuff like that. Where that idea for rondo comes from is probably from ternary form. Remember, ternary form is where we have an A-B-A form, and the A section is probably tonally closed, and the B section creates contrast with the A section. And the way rondo works is it just expands on that. Instead of having an A and a contrasting B and then the A again, a rondo form introduces a C. So it may have an A and then a B that creates contrast, and then you go back to A, and then you have a C that creates contrast, and then you come back to A. That's what we call a 5-part rondo. Or you can even have what we call a 7-part rondo, where you go A, B, A, C, A, B, A. Technically, all that you have to do to be a rondo is have an A section that's alternating with contrasting sections that are different letters. And in theory, you could have like an A, B, A, C, A, D, A, E, A, F, A, G, whatever rondo. Keep going and going and going. Most of the music in rondo form we have tends to be happy to work with just 3 sections, A, B, and C, and order them in either that 5-part or that 7-part design. And the reason why we draw it back to ternary is because what happens in sections B and C tends to create contrast with what we've been hearing in section A. So rondo takes that ternary idea of variety and contrast and expands upon it. And likewise, sonata form, or sonata allegro form, if you like to call it that instead, or first movement form, if you like to call it that. Sonata allegro form is best seen as descending from rounded binary form. Because in rounded binary form, you have section A and section B, and then the A comes back as A prime. And remember that the section B in a binary form tends to develop ideas from section A. Well, when we go to sonata form, we get rid of our labels A, B, A prime, and we replace them with the terms exposition, development, and recapitulation. But those are all analogous to the A and B and A prime section in binary forms. The thing that makes a sonata form bigger than a binary form is this. Sonata form has multiple themes.
A rounded binary form tends to just have like a melodic idea in the A section, and then develop that, and then bring back that melodic idea in the recapitulation. A sonata form, though, often has 2 or 3 or more themes that it presents in its exposition section. It's got what we call a primary theme, which shows up in the tonic key, and then shows up again at the beginning of the recapitulation in the tonic key. Then, in a sonata form exposition, there's a section called the transition, where we modulate away from the tonic and to some other key, quite likely the key we go to in binary form. If we start in C major, then we're probably going to modulate to C's dominant of G major. And then, when we've modulated to that other key, we have a secondary theme being stated in that related key. And then a lot of sonata forms are content to have another theme in that related key called the closing theme. And in the recapitulation, we're going to encounter all these thematic ideas. The only thing that's not going to happen is we're not actually going to modulate away from the tonic key. We're going to stay in the tonic key. So if we were in C major, in the exposition, you'd hear the primary theme in C, then we'd modulate, and you'd hear the secondary and closing themes in G major, perhaps. But in the recapitulation, we hear the primary theme, and then after our transition, we wouldn't have actually modulated, so we'd hear our secondary and closing themes probably also in the key of C major. But that's how sonata form takes that rounded binary A, B, A prime and expands it into exposition, development, recapitulation. And again, a lot of it comes down to what's happening in the B section. And in the B section of a rounded binary form, we're developing. That's also what happens in the development section of a sonata form. So that's sort of the evolution of sonata form as we come to know it. And this brings us to one of our final questions, which is about sonata cycles, or what some people refer to as multi-movement form. This is really about those pieces that are called things like sonata in D minor or sonata in G or whatever. A lot of times that's not describing sonata form as a single movement thing, but it's describing an entire work of 3 or 4 movements, which are instrumental, hence the word sonata, meaning sounded rather than sung, cantata. So when we talk about a sonata cycle, we're talking about 3 or 4 movements, and if it's a 3-movement form, it usually follows a fast, slow, fast movement setup. This has been the case since the classical era, and it goes through, even a lot of modern composers who are classically oriented still use these 3 and 4 movement designs. But a 3-movement sonata cycle often starts with a first movement that is up-tempo and in sonata allegro form, which is why some people call that form first movement form. And that movement will be in the key of the piece. Like if the piece is called Sonata for Clarinet and Cello in G minor, that first movement's going to be a sonata form in the key of G minor. The second movement is a slow movement, and it could be ternary form or rondo or theme and variations. Really, it could be any type of form. It could even be sonata form, again, because these guys wrote sonata forms so much. But a lot of times ternary and rondo and theme and variations are the favored forms for the slow movements. And the key design is a little bit tricky. I call it the 1 hour earlier key approach. And that's basically where if you think about your keys in sort of a circle of fifths way, then if your first movement was in C major, right, the key of C major, no sharps and flats, is at the top of the clock there at 12 o'clock. If you set that clock back 1 hour to 11 o'clock, you're going to the key of 1 flat. So your second movement would be in the key of perhaps F major. And then your third movement's back in the tonic key, C major in my hypothetical example there. And it's a fast movement. A lot of times this is where composers like to write rondos or sonata rondos, but things like themes and variations are not off the table. And that's how the 3-movement sonata cycle works. Here's how a 4-movement design goes. Now for a 4-movement sonata cycle, a lot of the same things stay in effect. You've still got the same form for the first, second, and last movements, but there's a third movement inserted, which is what we come to know as the scherzo. a very, very fast movement. A lot of times scherzo are in composite ternary forms, like a minuet in trio form or a scherzo in trio form or whatever. So that's sort of what we're talking about when we're talking about 4-movement sonata cycles. As I've said before, one of the best things you can do is write down these answers on these worksheets and then keep them where you can pull them out whenever you need them for reference when you're doing assignments with the pieces we're going to analyze. So if you find yourself wondering what's the deal with augmented sixth chords or how do fugal works work, you can pull out these sheets and they'll be there to help you. So I will just see you all on our next video where we talk about the Chopin C major prelude. See you on video 4. Enjoy.